Yes. I don't capture moments, I capture ideas. And what does it take to turn an idea into a picture, and how do you make it look realistic? My name is Erik Johansson, and I'm a photographer and retoucher from Sweden. I live here in Berlin, and today I would like to talk about how I try to capture the impossible. Can we get the picture on the screen, please? Do we have it? There, perfect, thank you. To me, photography and post-productions are equally important, and they're just two parts of the same process. Shooting is more about collecting material than capturing a moment, and trying to capture something that isn't there, but make it look as if it was. Ideas can be very different, but I always want them to tell a story, something that makes you think. And today I would like to give an insight in the way I work, and I would like to talk about the process on how I create these pictures, from sketching, planning, finding locations, shooting all the material, and putting it all together in Photoshop. A little bit about ideas and inspiration, and have a closer look at some of my files as well. But first I would like to tell you how I got into photography and post-production in the first place. I've always been a very visual person. I always liked drawing, and I also had a big interest in computers. But it was not until my 15th birthday, when I got this little thing, that I figured out a way that I could combine my two interests. And I started taking pictures with this digital camera. But being used to drawing, which is a process where you come up with an idea and then create something, it was a bit different to me having just a camera, that you capture something and then you're done. So I wanted it to be more of a process, and the technique was a bit different, but the way of thinking was the same. So I wanted to start with a picture, and then I wanted to create something and fill it with something from my imagination, where pressing the trigger would only be the start. It was pretty basic stuff in the beginning, and I just did it for fun. It was mostly a hobby by the time, so I started studying computer engineering instead. But during my studies, I took up my interest for photography and photo manipulations once again. And at this point, I knew the basics and started making more complex compositions. I started putting some pictures online and started getting some commission requests. And by the time I was done, I decided to become a photographer instead. And even though I never worked as an engineer, I think I have an engineering and problem-solving approach to the way I create these pictures. Because it's really about problem-solving. I do a lot of commission work as well, but I think the personal work is what's most important, and that's what I'm showing you here today. Because the personal work is a creative investment, and it's a good way for you to control where you want to go with your work and what jobs you want to have. I think it's better to do what you want instead of doing what people think that you want. But Photoshop is obviously a big part of my workflow. But I don't call myself a digital artist. Because it's not the skill in Photoshop that creates these images. It's what happens before. I shoot all the parts myself, and I never use stock photography or CGI in my personal work. So it's a lot about problem solving and finding all the different places. But it also gives me more control of every step. But before getting started, you need to get inspired. And it's a little bit hard to, I think, explain, because it's, I think, quite different from person to person. But to me, inspiration is about, it's about something that you can see everywhere. I think it's more about looking at the world differently, questioning logic, and try to see things a different way. Starting simple, and just try to make a connection between two things that normally wouldn't really go together. I also try to ask myself, why is it interesting? If it has a message, or if it's just looking good visually. And also, why is it happening? Because even crazy ideas need some kind of logic for us to be able to relate to it. It's also about limitations, because coming up with ideas, you can think of almost anything. But for example, just shooting all the material yourself, you have to be able to access those locations. So to me, that is about trying to come up with ideas with stuff that is around me and stuff that I see every day. And I can't, for example, make a picture in a desert or jungle because I don't really have access to those locations. But just to give you a short example of what that could be, seeing a connection between different things. So I had this idea about I wanted to put big instruments in nature. I thought that could be interesting, but I wanted it to have some kind of connection to something in the nature. So I thought, what can I connect the guitar with something else? And I thought about maybe power lines could actually work because they carry electricity, they kind of look the same. They have 3 power lines instead of 6, but maybe I can duplicate it to make it match the guitar. And electric guitar, power lines, makes sense. So I created this picture out of that. There's obviously a few steps in between, but it always starts like that, with thinking about a connection between things. Just another example. I also thought about, I saw this like dotted line in a magazine where you could cut stuff out, and I thought, it's kind of fun how you can cut it up, and maybe what if something else could be cut up like that, like a landscape or something else. But where do you have this dotted line in nature? And I thought about just, a road, for example. That could maybe work. So I bought some paper, just played around a bit, just see what it would look like in different ways and how it could behave. I thought maybe the dotted line in the road could be what's opening up the landscape. And I created this picture. So I want to explain a little bit more of what happens in between here. So it's not going to be like this all the time. But as you can see, the result is something like this. But when you see what it comes from, it's not that hard to imagine how it actually starts. It's a very simple idea from the beginning. It just needs time to develop to create this picture. And the process I use to create these images is always divided into 3 different steps, where it starts with coming up with ideas and planning, trying to figure out where you can find all the different locations and how you can actually put this all together. Then it's about collecting the material, or shooting, and finally the fun part, putting it together in Photoshop. And that's basically putting the pieces of the puzzle together. So I wanted to go through these steps a little bit more in detail, and starting with idea planning and locations. I have a lot of these sketchbooks, and I don't really realize that many of the ideas that I come up with. I think it's good to start simple and then go back to it and try to ask yourself, why is it interesting? Then you can choose the best ideas instead. An idea always feels great when it comes to you, but I think it's better to wait a bit, let it set, and come back to it and develop it. And always make a sketch as soon as you come up with an idea, otherwise it will be gone in the next moment. It's also about planning. You have to be able to realize the picture, and it requires a lot of planning. When you draw, you can do almost anything. But when you want to make it photorealistic, you have to capture every part with a camera, which can be a problem. But every problem can be broken down into smaller problems. And in the end, it's just a combination of photographs. Just like a nice painting is just a combination of brushstrokes. So in this example, for example, you can see that, obviously there can't be a place like this, so you just have to figure out where you can capture all the different places and all the different cars in this example, for example. When finding locations, I usually use Google Street View or think about places I already know. And sometimes it takes time, because for this picture, for example, I had to shoot the summer part, and then I had to wait for 6 months, and then shoot the lower part. So it's good to work with several projects in parallel. Well, anyway, collecting material or shooting all the pictures you need with a camera. Because to me, shooting or taking photos is just about collecting material. capturing all the pieces you need to put together in Photoshop. And there are two main, the most important factors when it comes to collecting the material is perspective and light. Because most other things can be changed in post, such as color, hue, saturation, brightness. And when you shoot it at many different locations, it's important to keep that in mind to make it look good. Starting with perspective. So, I usually try to find an interesting perspective, something a little bit higher to give you a nice overview. And I had this idea about placing a house on the top of a cliff. And in my first apartment here in Berlin, I lived in Charlottenburg, and I had this clear view of this building from my window, and I thought this building could be perfect for this photo. But I can only see this building from this specific window, and otherwise I would have to shoot it from the ground, and I like this perspective. So with perspective, it's always good to start with a part that's hardest to change. You have tools in Photoshop for changing the perspective as well, but that usually works best for very boxy objects. When it comes to nature, usually things aren't that boxy. They are more organic. So I decided to start from this perspective, and then I had to shoot the rest of the parts. So starting with a picture like this, putting it into Photoshop, then just drawing out the perspective lines to see what it looks like, and then you can figure out where to place the other parts of the photo. Sometimes I also use a program called SketchUp, which essentially does the same, where you can draw on top of a photo to get a perspective, just draw in perspective instead. So then I knew that I wanted to place a bridge there, I wanted to place a staircase, and it would all follow the perspective of the picture that I began with. And then it turned into this. So I think what's important to think about is that start with a picture that's the hardest to change the perspective of, and then just match the rest of the picture to that picture. Secondly is light to think about when you combine pictures. It's mainly two things to think about, and that is direction and size of the light. Obviously here you have the direction coming from the right, and with a bigger light source you have a softer light, obviously, and a smaller light source you have a harder light. But it's not only that, it's also that a shadow becomes darker closer to the object, and with a hard shadow it also becomes softer further away from the object. So it's good to keep that in mind also when you try to capture something like that. Personally, I like the look of natural light. To me, it's easier to imagine being part of a scene if it looks real. So either I shoot it in natural light or I use flashes to make it look natural. If you shoot outside, it's pretty good to use apps such as Sunseeker to see where the sun will be throughout the day. But usually, I think it's good to keep it simple in order to relate to the scene that you're creating. You can also use perspective. This is a very specific case, but you can use perspective also if you have the sun in the picture to determine where the shadows will be. That's, yeah, just good to mention. But then, it's about putting it together when you have all the material, and that's the fun part. Photoshop is a very powerful tool, and it's from beginners to professionals, and everyone is using it. I learned Photoshop for the past 15 years, and I'm still learning today, and I think it's very exciting to see all the new features coming all the time and all the updates. So I think that's going to be super fun to try out. There are so many tutorials online on how to do different techniques. So I think there's no point of me standing here explaining how to do that, because I think people are better than me at that. But do you know what the best trick to create realistic smoke in Photoshop is? It is to actually photograph smoke. Because I think it always looks better if you actually capture it. Besides, it's more fun to do something for real, and no one can tell you that it doesn't look realistic if you actually capture it for real. So to me, Photoshop is a very powerful tool, a tool to make the transition between the material I shoot seamless. And I don't use very advanced tools when I create these images. There are great tools in Photoshop that I love, like the perspective warp that came with the last version, for example. But this is what I used most of the time. And it's basically the magnetic lasso, the pen tool, or the channels to separate the different parts. I use the masking just to see what you want to see, and then I use the brush tool and the smudge tool to change the masks. And then I basically just use the hue saturation layer or the curve layer to adjust the different parts and make them all come together nicely. I always work in a very non-destructive way and try to keep all the layers, because I think there's no reason to merge layers, because you have all these smart objects and you can apply filters on top of the smart objects. You can create groups, and I think it's pretty nice to be able to have everything there, because if you want to change the sky in the end, then you have it in the bottom layer and you can just go back there and change it. Normally it takes a couple of days to put these pictures together, and I always ask myself, what would this look like if it would have been photographed? That's my point of reference. It's kind of hard when you sit for a very long time with these pictures in Photoshop. Because, I mean, how do you know what looks good after you see it for such a long time? You just stare into the monitor and just look at the same pictures. I think it's good to get away sometimes and try to get back to it and see it with new eyes. Leave it for a while, maybe a day or a week, and try to get back to it, maybe ask other people. But one thing that I think works really well also is flipping a picture. It's something I don't do too early. I try to wait to do it in the end, but I think that's really the best way to see a picture for the first time. To actually just flip it, and then it feels like you're seeing something completely new. But you shouldn't do too early, because if you do, then you get used to seeing it that way as well, and then it doesn't work anymore. So, I wanted to just show you the process quite briefly, how it works. So I thought that I can actually show you a little bit what the files might actually look like when I create these photos. So let's see how we do this, to clean up a bit. It's not really working that hard on this on this surface. I need something for... So, why not start with this picture? I did this picture in 2009, so it's a couple of years old. But I think it still kind of shows how this is built up in a pretty nice way. You have all the layers here, and as you can see, I always try to keep everything. And I thought I can just take you through it. So, starting with the sky like this, put a layer of water on top of it, like that. Doesn't really look like water, but when you put some rocks in the foreground, it might, which actually looks like this. It's from a stone pit that I found that I thought could work really well for this. I cut it out like this. I found some water at some other places that I thought could work really well. The shores is from a different location. I photographed a fish on a fishing trip, on a vacation. So it was actually quite a coincidence that it turned out to be this one, but became famous, I guess. I always keep it as a smart layer inside, and I can still go into Camera Raw and change all the different parts of it like this if I want to. I mask it. Now it looks kind of cut in there. So I had to match it in color using different color layers, mainly curves and hue saturation. Putting a solid layer of blue on top of it. Putting down the opacity. Dodge and burn a couple of layers, some light on top of it, and some shadow underneath. Some boats, I photographed this island on a different part. Usually it's pretty hard to find the locations. I think it's better just to try to create it. But as long as you just match perspective and light, it usually works pretty well. I even decided to turn the house red because I didn't think it looked Swedish enough. But you know. On the top, I just put a few adjustment layers to make it a little bit warmer. And that's what it looks like. Thank you. I did show this one before, actually, but I thought that it could be fun to show you something new as well. this one I did this year, and I haven't shown this to anyone, and there's no behind-the-scenes material from this one. So I thought this could be fun to have a look at. So this one I did 6 years later, and you can tell because there's about 5 times more layers. And this is a crazy file. It's about 7 gigabytes, and it's huge, and it contains a lot of information. But building a scene like this with a double perspective, where it looks like this man is sitting both inside and outside, it's kind of hard. You have to think a lot about how you make it look and what parts should be inside, what parts should be outside. But the trick to create these images, I basically make a grid on top of it, and the trick to create this illusion is that all lines in each direction are parallel. So there's no vanishing point, really. It's like you would shoot this house from a very far distance. So they are all parallel. So I use this as a base, and let's see if I can actually do this in a very logical way. Could start from the bottom with a background, but I think that doesn't really make sense, because what I would start with would actually be the person in the picture, which is this one. So I photographed this person in a place that I built up something very similar, and I put a light here with a warm filter just to make it look kind of similar, like I wanted it to be. And I built up the scene like this. I cut him out. And placed him in here. I put some background in. Maybe this wasn't really the order. Let's see. I put the floor in. You can see the different parts coming out here. Let's see if I can find the right part. The house. Okay. I'm not, as it's very revealing, showing all these layers that are called layer 37 and all that. I think it's, as long as the layer groups are named correctly, I think it's okay. But you can't really always name all the layers the right way. That would take forever. Okay, let's see. So the trees, the ground. I photographed the ground separately like this with a light, so we would also get the same kind of light around the house. Cut it out. I thought it would make sense because you don't really have a horizon when you see it from the up and down at the same time. So I thought it would be good to just make it a bit foggy. Put some trees to get it a little bit more like a natural feeling. Put the floor in, which looks pretty flat and boring at the moment. Carpet, some shadows, and the good thing that I shot this and I built up this scene for real was that I could see exactly where the shadow would hit, so I could make it very similar. The house looks pretty boring from the beginning too, but I make it darker and just try to match the light. All right, let's see. Keep stepping it up, speed up a little bit. All right, we're getting there. And a little dog. I even spend a lot of time making this. I spend about a day just making all these sketches just to make sure that if someone would ever see it in a print, you would actually see all the details and all the different notes that I did here, even though most people will see it just on a web like this. It felt a little bit artificial in the end, even though it makes sense with the light and perspective. So I just added some adjustment layers on top just to a little bit extra fog, desaturated the colors a little bit, increased the contrast, and created a little bit warmer feeling. And there you have the end result. About 250 layers in total. That's what it looks like. Whoops. So, I showed you the process. Now it begins from the beginning. Well, I showed you the process from idea to final image. In the end, it's a lot about problem solving and how to figure out what you need to shoot in order to create something. Shooting and putting it together is just realization, and in the end, what's important is what you can imagine. Thank you for listening.